From Kansas State University, this is Agriculture Today. Eric Atkinson here. Coming up today, K-State's Gregg Ibendahl will review his new outlook on Kansas net farm income for 2020 and 21, as presented at K-State's Risk and Profit Conference last week. He'll talk about changes in farm revenue and expenses this year and why he thinks 2021 could be a better year for farm income in the state. Then from the Washburn University School of Law, Roger McEowen is back. He'll take a look at the tax deduction allowances when farm property is destroyed by a natural calamity, as was the case in the Corn Belt last week. And, of course, later, K-State's Gus Vanderhoeven with another Stop, Look, and Listen. That and more ahead on this Agriculture Today.
A social distancing tip.
Putting distance between yourself and others is critical to slowing the spread of coronavirus. So here are ways to stay in contact without the physical contact part. Call, send a text, set up a video conference, post on social media, dedicate a song on the radio. If you have symptoms of fever, dry cough, and shortness of breath, call your healthcare provider before going to their office. For more info, visit coronavirus.gov.
Let's all do our part, because we're all #alone together. Brought to you by the Ad Council.
You are tuned in to the K-State Radio Network. Welcome once more to Agriculture Today. Well, the state of farm income here in Kansas is of perpetual interest, of course, and it was a topic that was featured at that virtual Risk and Profit Conference that K-State Agricultural Economics hosted last week. Gregg Ibendahl is a research and extension agricultural economist here at K-State. And Gregg, you wanted to share with the Risk and Profit Conference audience some thoughts on where we may be headed when all is said and done with income on our farms and ranches in Kansas, not only this year, but looking ahead. So how did you approach this? What variables were you looking at as you tackle a pretty big question here?
Well, 2019 was actually a fairly good year for farmers in Kansas. We actually had net farm income rise for 4 years in a row going into that. So, coming into 2020, it looked like it was going to be a fairly good year. But obviously the whole virus thing happened and, the people were starting to wonder about what might happen to net farm income. Well, we have some ways to look at that by using our KFMA data where we have, all these farmers in the state who participate and actually share their data with us. We can use that as a baseline. So we use that, kind of what happened in 2019, and then we made adjustments on the revenue side, on the expense side, and kind of looked at what yields were going to be roughly to kind of get an idea what might happen for net farm income for this coming year.
All right. Well, let's go through those. Changes in revenue, this takes many forms, including those government payments.
Yeah, so 2019, part of the reason why that was a better year than the previous 3 years was we had this special market facilitation payment, and that was a fairly good-sized payment. And we knew coming in that was probably just going to be a 1-year thing or 2-year thing, and we weren't going to have it this year. So we knew right away with that not being in place, that was probably going to be lower because of that. But certainly government payments are a big source, but then the revenue side, we saw big effects on both the supply and demand side, both on the crops and livestock side. So for initially when we did this first analysis, we were looking at some pretty good reductions on most of the grains and also on the beef side and the swine side too. We were expecting to see some lower revenue on the grain side, like corn. We were looking at it to be like 16% lower. Well, because of that, then you probably have a better chance of getting a crop insurance payment. Most farmers in the state, they have the crop revenue coverage thing, which has a revenue component to it. So when those prices were first set back in February, farmers were probably thinking, oh, this is a pretty low price to use on the crop insurance calculation. Well, when by the time we got to mid-March and April, those prices were actually looking pretty good. So there's likely a fairly good possibility that we will have higher crop insurance payment this year because of those prices that were built into the contract back in February.
And to finish the changes in revenue on the crop side, you mentioned corn 16% lower. The other grains were also lower?
Yeah, some of that, though, reflects both the combination of higher yields. So back in 2018, our 19 wheat was a fairly bad year for growing wheat with low yields. So we expected to be more normal yields this year for wheat. So that we looked at an 8% reduction in revenue for this coming year. But that reflects that's higher yield that we saw this year relative to what we had in the previous year.
And then grain and sorghum also lower by, 5%?
5%, corn 16% lower, soybeans 11% lower.
When we look back at the government payments, though, not only the payments for market facilitation, but also the coronavirus payments, and what's to be expected from the standard payment program, the ARC and PLC, and you factored that in as well.
Yeah, it was fairly easy to predict the PLC amount because most farmers in the state did sign up for the PLC coverage, except there's some soybean acres in southeast Kansas that went with the ARC coverage. So those were pretty well known in advance, and we can look at what the expected yields were going to be. And then some of my colleagues here have been looking at what they expect the PLC payments were going to be. So we can get a fairly accurate idea of what we think the government payment number is going to be. And as long as we assume our KFMA farms are kind of representative of what the average farm is in the county, we should come up pretty close. So by the time you do that, I think our latest projections, we show that the PLC payment on wheat is about 90 cents, sorghum is a 67, and corn has been bumped up to 13 cents. We still don't expect any payment on the soybean side. That could still change depending on what the marketing year average price turns out to be. Well, we're getting close enough now to the end of the marketing year that most of those should be fairly close at this point in time. There may be a little bit of adjustment back and forth. But when we figure those in and look at what the government payment number is going to be, we probably are about twice as high as what we were last year. So that'll help offset some of the lower revenue we're seeing from lower grain prices.
That's on the revenue side. You also took up, as you said, Greg, the changes in farm expenses out there, and those are noteworthy, are they not?
Yeah, because, some of the expense numbers are pretty high, and we can get some estimates for those. Fertilizer especially, because we know that fertilizer makes up about 20% of a farmer's crop expenses per acre here. And we can come up with some pretty good estimates for that. I have an earlier paper in Ag Manager looking at fertilizer price as a function of both the oil price and the corn futures price. It turns out that fertilizer price tends to lag the oil price by about 9 months. So, we can look at the oil price now and about 9 months from now kind of make a prediction for what we think fertilizer prices are going to be. Well, one aspect of this whole virus thing was there was a tremendous drop-off in demand for oil, as you might guess. People were staying home when they weren't driving. Even now, with the economy bouncing back a little bit, we're still about 10% off our normal oil demand. So because of that, I was predicting fertilizer prices for anhydrous ammonia basically to drop down from about $5.60 was the average price in 2019, down to about $4.24 somewhere this year. Again, that's a national price. It may not be reflective of what the Kansas price is, but that's a pretty significant drop in the fertilizer price. And the same thing with diesel price. Obviously, as the oil price goes down, the diesel price is going to go down too. So those two categories of expense items, fertilizer and fuel, both should be quite a bit lower. The only bad thing is farmers probably had bought a lot of their fertilizer and fuel before they started going down. So I'm predicting they're not going to see all those gains or benefits this year. Probably a 2021 year, they'll see the full benefit of having lower fuel and fertilizer prices. So I really expect fertilizer prices for especially the nitrogen fertilizers, but really all fertilizers to decline a fair amount yet going through the course of the year here. So I would, if I was a producer, I would start looking maybe at buying my fertilizer and fuel as much as I could, probably later on this fall going into winter. I think that would be a good time to look at that. That will help with your expenses for the coming year.
All right. And there's one other aspect of expenses that needs to be mentioned here. You did so in your presentation. Interest rates, which have been holding pretty firm, how has that affected the expense associated with debt?
Well, they're not going to go a whole lot higher. The only thing we got to watch out for, though, is I think farmers are adding a little more debt, and you got to watch out for that in your balance sheet because sometimes you can add debt and not really realize you're doing it. So the fact that farmers have been adding more debt, mainly because family living expenses have been exceeding what we've been getting for net farm income. The typical family in Kansas, both farm and non-farm, probably spends about $75,000 a year in family living. Well, net farm income has been below that for the last few years. So farmers, to make up for that, like anybody else would do, you need to meet family living needs. So you have to do that some way, and either through a combination of probably, not paying down some of their operating loan or maybe buying new equipment, not paying it off right away. They have been increasing levels of debt on their balance sheets, which in turn is going to lead to higher levels of interest expense.
Well, throwing all of this into the pot, so to speak, Gregg, looking at revenue changes, what's happening with those expenses as you described, where does this come down in as far as expected net farm income here in 2020 when it's all said and done?
Well, my initial estimate back in May when I was first looking at this, net farm income in 2019, once we took off that market facilitation payment, we were about $50,000. I had expected it to drop to about $14,000 or $15,000. That was about a 71% reduction in net farm income. I have since revised that, though, so when you figure in a little bit higher government payments, and especially now we have the new payment for the coronavirus thing going on, too, so that adds a little bit of money from these new payments that we have going on. Now I'm predicting probably a bottom line number, probably of about a net farm income of $21,000. I may be a little bit pessimistic, though, because I think listening to Glenn Townser's beef report, I don't think my beef estimate number is probably on the low side here. So I would look at that $21,000 I'm predicting for net farm income probably as a bottom line number. I really think it's probably going to be a little bit higher than that. But even when considering that, that's still probably about a 50 or 60% reduction over what it was last year. So we're still looking at a pretty significant drop in net farm income for 2020 compared to what it was in 2019.
So then, you took it one further in your presentation and tossed out some ideas on what net farm income in Kansas might look like in 2021. Is the momentum continuing toward improvement in your forecast?
Yeah, I definitely think next year will actually be a better year. Glenn is forecasting much better beef prices next year. I think the grain prices may bounce back a little bit. Certainly farmers will get the full benefit of lower fertilizer and fuel prices. So I think 2021 should definitely be, I don't want to say definitely, but has a high likelihood of being higher net farm income than what we're expecting for this year.
So things are still to be told, of course, and who knows what's ahead given the uncertainties that the year 2020 have brought to bear. Good insight, Gregg, that you shared at Risk and Profit and with us as well on where we may be headed with our net farm income as we head down the latter stages of 2020 and then into 2021. Thanks for the observations, as always.
Yes, thanks.
Gregg Ibendahl presented that very information at the aforementioned Risk and Profit Conference put on by K-State last week. He's an agricultural economist with K-State Research and Extension on his net farm income projections for this year and next on Agriculture Today. And we'll be back with more on the K-State Radio Network.
Man, it's hot out here. Heat stress affects more than just humans. It also affects livestock. Extreme heat, humidity, wind speeds, and cloud cover all make a difference in air temperature. To control problems, make sure your livestock have shade and water provided at all times. This will help prevent problems in breeding, meat production, and reduce chances of death. Please take all these into consideration for livestock production. Brought to you by K-State Animal Science Leadership Academy participants.
Next up for you on Agriculture Today, it's our regular get-together to talk agricultural law and taxation matters. Joining us via phone, Professor of Agricultural Law and Taxation at the Washburn University School of Law, Roger McEowen, as we'll take on two topics, Roger, that you've featured recently in your blog posts, and we'll remind folks of the website for which to access those in a couple of moments. One of these inspired by the recent weather events in the Corn Belt, massive damage to farms in that region, Iowa, Illinois, Indiana, from that derecho storm that kicked through here a few days back. And this has raised some questions, you say, about the taxation consideration of building back from a storm.
Well, indeed it has, unfortunately. I've said many times that I don't have to worry about what I'm going to write on. Unfortunately, the weather wrote this one. And one of the questions that I got immediately the next day or so in numerous emails and telephone calls to me from farmers, particularly in Iowa and Illinois, but also in Indiana, from that storm is, now I've got buildings and structures that I'm going to have to demolish. It's pointless to try to rebuild them, to repair them. I just need to knock them down. Can I get a deduction for my costs associated with demolishing them? And the answer is generally no. There is a code section that says when you demolish any structure, there's no deduction is allowed if you own it or you're the lessee of the structure for any amount that you expend for demolition or any loss sustained on account of the demolition. What you have to do is you have to take those amounts, those costs that you incur in demolition, and basically add it to the basis in your land. Now, that's the general rule. So no current deduction, just take that cost, keep track of it, add it to the basis in your land. If you ever sell the land, you're going to have a relatively higher basis. That's where you would recover that cost.
You said generally there. Are there any exceptions, though, particularly after a casualty, as it's put legally, such as a storm taking out, say, a battery of grain bins?
Yeah, there can be. And it's going to depend on each person's situation. And associated with demolishing buildings, of course, we've got trees and brush and all types of things. And there's another tax rule that says you don't get a deduction for removing trees, stumps, brush, or anything associated with clearing land for making it suitable for use in farming. You can't do that. So if you're going to remove buildings and trees and cap wells and grade the land and do those types of things now because of this storm to make it re-suitable for farming, again, you're going to have to add all those costs into the basis of the land. But maybe some exceptions. If you had used the property in your trade or business of farming for a period of time before demolishing it, which is the situation here for many people, depreciation, of course, can be claimed for the period of that business use. So that storm a few days ago, you can take depreciation for the year up until the time of the storm. Then you can't, you're going to have to take those demolition costs and add it into the basis of the real estate. Now, if you bought the property, this is another situation that's out there. I had an email from an individual who said, I bought a farm, and there are structures that I wanted to demolish on it. That was my plan this fall, to wipe them out so that I could increase the tillable acreage. Now I don't have to. The storm wiped it out. What do I do in that situation? Well, if you purchase the property with the intent of demolishing the buildings or structures after using them in your trade or business for a period of time, so if you were storing things in them, but you were eventually going to demolish them, and now they've been wiped out, then the fact that you intended ultimately to demolish those buildings is taken into account in making an apportionment of basis between the land and the buildings. There's a specific Treasury regulation on that. Now, if you just abandon those buildings, that's treated as a disposition or a sale price at zero, and so your remaining income tax basis becomes an ordinary loss that gets reported to the IRS on a Form 4797. But now, if you had a casualty, and which is what happened with that storm, when the casualty occurs, the normal capitalization rule that I talked about doesn't apply where that structure is damaged by the casualty that's then demolished. And so those amounts expended to demolish the buildings and structures that were damaged in that windstorm and to any loss sustained on account of that demolition are not under the capitalization rule. Instead, what happens in that instance is that the income tax basis that you had in that structure is reduced by the deductible casualty loss before the loss sustained on account of the demolition is determined. So if you've got a farm building or a structure that was destroyed in that storm, the basis in the building at the time of the storm would be deductible as a casualty loss. Now, I'm assuming there's no insurance that's paid because that's going to complicate things. Mm-hmm. But the cost of clearing up the mess left behind would be capitalized into the land's basis. So you have two pieces to it. You're going to take a deductible casualty loss, and then your cleanup of the mess, you're going to add that into your land basis. So basically, Eric, what happens is the loss you sustained before demolition is not treated as being sustained on account of the demolition. So the result is you get a deductible casualty loss, then you take your cleanup costs and add that into the basis of your land. And that's going to be the situation for the vast majority of people affected by that storm last week.
Well, as with just about anything involved with a tax code, the nitty-gritty is important. So one would need to flesh this out with their tax preparer as they move forward. But you've got a great write-up on this on your blog, which folks can reference, and we'll tell them how in just a second. The other item today on exotic game farms and whether they qualify as farms for taxation purposes. This is a question you get fairly frequently as well, you say, Roger.
Well, I get it more often than I did, say, 20, 25 years ago, and I think that's a sign of farmers and ranchers trying to find more economical uses for their property. And what these farms have shown is that you can generate more dollars per acre and more revenue for smaller type tracts. And even though some of these may not be small size tracts, we've got, for example, in Texas alone, there's over 4 million acres that are devoted to wild game farming activities. So what I'm talking about here would be the captive deer situation or the elk situation or whatever it might be. And some of these are very big ranches, but some of them are smaller, and they may have a tract where they raise and breed the animals, and they may have a separate tract where they release them for guided hunts. But these are the ones that are, we've probably seen these, listeners have probably seen the high fences, the so-called deer fences or the elk fences. They can't get out, so they're captive, but yet they're still wild game, or are they? Are they wild game? Are they livestock? What difference does it make? And basically, the tax code, when it comes to defining the term farm or farming or ranching or what a farmer is, it depends on the code section that you're looking at, because there are different definitions depending on where it's used at in the code. But basically, it's a very broad definition. And to make a long story short, wild game and exotic animals are generally defined as livestock. And there actually is a specific IRS technical advice memorandum that came out of the National Office of IRS back in 1995, and was published in early 1996, that dealt with this. And this was a captive deer type operation. And the IRS said, look, the code and the Treasury regulations don't define the terms farmer, farms, or the business of farming. But there were other code sections they looked at and said that basically any mammal that's held for breeding or sporting purposes meets the definition of livestock. And they said that wild game, that captive deer activity did involve livestock. It does involve farming. And that's a big deal, because if you are a farmer and you're engaged in a traded business of farming, then you've got a whole host of other provisions in the tax code that you can use that are very favorable to you that non-farmers cannot use.
One of the things that could be considered there as far as provisions, depreciation of those livestock and how they would be handled. Would it be the same as with customary livestock like cattle, hogs, and so forth?
Well, cattle, sheep, and goats have a 5-year recovery period under the Modified Accelerated Cost Recovery System. Breeding hogs is a 3-year property, and any property that's not described in an asset class by IRS or used in a described activity defaults to 7 years. So where do you put this stuff? The IRS guidance, and the key one on this is the revenue procedure in 1987, doesn't mention exotic game animals. So I think by default they end up in the 7-year property for depreciation purposes. But as farm animals, and therefore a depreciable asset that's used in farming, I think you can also argue that while they would have a recovery period of 7 years, their alternative life would be 10 years instead of, under that system, there's two different types of depreciation systems. Instead of 12, they'd be 10. And because there's no requirement for depreciation that animals be domesticated, you could also argue that maybe a 5-year recovery period applies for certain types of exotic sheep and goats. So it depends on what you're raising in terms of their depreciation classification. Perhaps all ruminant exotic game animals could be classified as 5-year maker property on the basis that the livestock species in the 5-year category currently are ruminant animals, cattle, sheep, and goats. Hogs and horses, non-ruminants, they have different recovery periods than cattle, sheep, and goats. So it's kind of a fun question to deal with, but we do see more of these types of activities on farmland, on agricultural land as time goes by, and that includes Kansas too.
Again, Roger writes on this question and the other that we addressed today, plus much more, in his regularly updated blogs, and those can be found at washburnlaw.edu/WALTR. Make that a regular part of your online reading, washburnlaw.edu/WALTR. Good summary, Roger. As always, many thanks to you.
Thank you, Eric.
From the Washburn University School of Law, Roger McEowen. Roger's along with us every other Wednesday, right here on Agriculture Today.
Make hand washing a healthy habit everywhere you go. Wash your hands with soap and water for at least 20 seconds, especially after going to the bathroom, before, during, and after preparing food, and before eating. If soap and water aren't available, use a hand sanitizer that has at least 60% alcohol. Life is better with clean hands. A message from the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention.
You're listening to Agriculture Today over the K-State Radio Network, now in its 96th year of broadcast service to agriculture here in Kansas and the Central Plains. Eric Atkinson with you, and now today's agricultural news headlines, courtesy in part of DTN. Well, the USDA's National Agricultural Statistics Service will be updating its harvested acreage information for corn and soybeans in Iowa. In preparation for the September 11th crop production report, the agency is saying the two crops have been particularly impacted by the recent derecho. NASS said the additional data will help to better assess the full impact of that storm that rolled across the state a week ago last Monday. If the newly collected data justifies any changes, NASS will publish updated harvested acreage estimates in that September report, according to the agency. Meantime, Iowa Secretary of Agriculture Mike Negg says that the USDA's Risk Management Agency has reported 57 counties in Iowa were in the path of the storm. In those counties, there are 14 million acres of insured crops, including 8.2 million acres of corn, 5.6 million acres of beans that may have been impacted, in his words. Beyond the damage to crops, Negg also said the state has lost tens of millions of bushels of grain storage just weeks before harvest is to start. 3 dicamba registrants lost one of their last remaining legal options to overturn a federal court's mandate ending the registrations of 3 dicamba herbicides. On June the 3rd, you'll recall, a panel of 3 judges on the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Ninth Circuit issued a decision to vacate those 3 dicamba herbicides, XtendiMax, Ingenia, and Fexapan. On July the 20th, all 3 companies petitioned for a broader group of Ninth Circuit judges to rehear that case. They argued that the judge's initial decision was unfair, unconstitutional, and required a full judicial review. On Monday, the Ninth Circuit Court disagreed and dismissed those requests, known as petitions for rehearing en banc. This decision leaves the 3 companies with one final legal option to overturn the Ninth Circuit ruling and appeal to the U.S. Supreme Court. Now, all 3 companies, Bayer, BASF, and Corteva Agriscience, are weighing that appeal possibility. In the meantime, the EPA is actively evaluating new registrations for Bayer's XtendiMax and BASF's Ingenia herbicides and are expected to make a decision sometime this fall. Both companies submitted additional data and products to the agency for review and have expressed optimism that growers will have access to their dicamba herbicides for use in Xtend crops in 2021. According to one USDA economist, the beef cattle sector is gradually returning to some semblance of normalcy. Here's more from the USDA's Gary Crawford.
Turning a little bit back toward normal.
In the beef sector, according to USDA Outlook Board Chairman Mark Czekanowski, after the plant closures and slowdowns in the spring, he says slaughter capacity now is just about up to pre-COVID levels.
There is still, however, a backlog of cattle that would have been slaughtered in March or April that continues to hang over the market today, although the industry has been working through that backlog.
But the damage is done. This year's beef production is projected to be down 0.5% from last year, the first yearly decline in 5 years. For 2021, we could see a 2% bounce back, but it's still hard to predict what's going to happen in the beef market. Too much uncertainty about demand.
But we're in a lot better place now than we were a few months ago.
Steer prices crawling back up. They could average about $107 a hundredweight this year.
And we expect that to continue to increase into 2021.
About a $2.50 increase. Gary Crawford for the U.S. Department of Agriculture.
U.S. Secretary of Agriculture Sonny Perdue recently announced the application deadline for the Coronavirus Food Assistance Program has been extended to September the 11th now, and producers, including livestock producers who have approved applications, will receive final payments. Sam Capone offers this update.
USDA announced recently that the deadline to apply for the Coronavirus Food Assistance Program has been extended to September 11th. The original application deadline was August 28th. Producers with approved applications that initially received 80% of their CFAP payment should be receiving the remaining 20% from USDA in the coming months. Moving forward, producers who apply and are eligible for CFAP will receive 100% of their total payment, not to exceed the payment limitation upon application approval. CFAP payments are subject to a limitation of $250,000 per person or entity. This limitation applies to the total amount of CFAP payments made with respect to all eligible commodities. Special payment limitation rules will be applied to participants that are corporations, limited liability companies, and limited partnerships. These corporate entities may receive a payment limit increase of $250,000 for each additional owner beyond a single owner if each additional owner contributes 400 hours of active personal labor or active personal management for production of commodities for which a payment is claimed. The total limit, however, cannot exceed $750,000. For more information, go to the Coronavirus Response page on KLA.org. I'm Sam Capone.
On the agricultural calendar, K-State Research and Extension has 2 virtual crop field days coming up. One is a week from today, the other a week from tomorrow. K-State's Agricultural Research Center at Hayes will host its virtual fall field day, August the 26th. It'll run from noon to 1:30. The topics to be covered there include new herbicide-tolerant crop traits and weed control strategies for western Kansas. Vipon Kumar will address that. K-State's J.P. Michaud on the role of temperature in insect population dynamics, and K-State's Augustino Boer on dual use of cover crops for soil health and forage in dry land systems. And lastly, Ram Perumal of K-State will discuss sorghum hybrids for early and normal planting. That'll be the program for K-State's virtual fall field day out of the Agricultural Research Center at Hayes. And then the next day, August the 27th, the Southwest Research and Extension Center with its virtual fall field day. Here's the rundown of topics to be covered there. Alfalfa and corn insect management strategies, an update from K-State's Sarah Zukoff, and then a look at a decade of dryland cover crop research in western Kansas with K-State's John Holman. K-State's Jonathan Aguilar follows then with a look at expanding cotton recommendations. And lastly on that program, K-State's Anthony Zukoff on bee diversity and edge habitat of active croplands in western Kansas. Each of these programs is free, and to register, go to this address, kstate.ag/KSRE-field-day. Again, kstate, no hyphen, .ag/KSRE-field-day. You're listening to Agriculture Today.
When you are in need of timely, reliable, and trusted information, K-State Research and Extension is here. Whether it's organizing people, information, or resources, they have the necessary tools. Community comes first for K-State Research and Extension. For more information and to connect with your county's extension agents, visit www.ksre.k-state.edu.
This is Agriculture Today. Stop, look, and listen.
I struggled with the decision to attend the gathering in the restaurant.
That's Gus Vanderhoeven of Kansas State University with comment on life in rural Kansas.
Sunday afternoon, I sat in front of the TV and watched another episode of Pride of Our Nation. It is the series by Ken Burns of World War II, and I've been watching it for several episodes. At the end, I say, never, never forget. This Sunday's program followed the landings at Normandy, the landing at Omaha Beach, and the slow, ever so slow battles through the French dense hedge country and the breakthrough by Caen after it was heavily bombed and destroyed. No need to repeat the details. It's all there. The issue for me is to never forget. You hear the poignant letter of the mother who writes her son who is fighting to be careful while over there. Please be careful. Survival had so little to do with being careful. Maybe being well trained, wise and smart, but being careful? No. I look at a program like this not for the thrill. It's not a movie of which you know the actors will go home afterwards and feel good about themselves. Several years ago, I watched Private Ryan. Some people in my own family over there thought it was over-dramatized. To be honest, I did not agree. Maybe I had seen more as a child. Be assured I'm not afraid to argue. But sometimes, as the Dalai Lama once said, at times it is better to say nothing. The Dalai Lama is a wise man. Of course, that war is 75 years ago. Fewer and fewer of those who served are still alive today. When I lived in Australia during 1952 and 1959, I knew several people who had served in the Pacific fighting the Japanese, and one who had been a pilot flying patrols across the North Sea looking for German U-boats. But all have passed on, and their stories with them. That is why a TV program like this is so important, to see the destruction, carnage, and loss. It's sobering. We should never forget. It has always amazed me how destroyed cities have been rebuilt, some back to what they were, with historic buildings painstakingly rebuilt, sometimes with modern architecture, the one building more daring than the other. But it is the story of the mother writing her son, "Son, be careful over there," which has stayed with me. Last week, an old colleague and his wife came through town. They had gone to Colorado to celebrate their son's wedding. I don't know if it had been a large gathering of people, but as parents, they needed to be there. Both are pragmatic people. But I wonder if it might have been a perfect storm. A gathering of friends here in town had been planned on their way back to Pennsylvania, where they now live, retired. I struggled with the decision to attend the gathering in the restaurant. I struggled for days and asked my grandson. Students are back in town. You can see them, many packed in cars and pickups. They're happy, cheerful, and noisy. They're young and have pent-up energy. It was not only for me, but I decided also for my wife. There is risk. You can't be careful, but you can be wise. I wanted to be wise. I emailed that I would not be coming to the get-together in the restaurant. I felt bad and sad, but knew it was a wise decision. In my note, I left the option for our friends to stop by here on the hill. At least we could do some distancing and still talk. And that is how it worked out. I went to the bottom of our driveway just in case they forgot where we lived. I waited in the early evening. While standing there, I picked a perfect, tall, blue-stem stalk, 6 feet plus, tall, to show my friend and remind him what real grass looked like. After several cars passed, I watched their truck slow down and make the turn into our driveway. As they rolled the window down, I laughingly held the 6 feet tall grass stalk out to them to measure social distancing. I told them to drive on and park. I would follow. They were as excited as I was to see each other. They had photos of a gathering on the farm they wanted me to see. The horses coming to us on the farm, running. There was Pop-Tart, Misty, and Flash. I said, let's go in. But before you go, look at this. And I showed them the 3 skulls of the now dead horses, Pop-Tart, Misty, and Flash. We were looking at time gone by. Old age had put the horses down, except Flash. He got killed by lightning. It was still too hot to sit on the deck, so we went inside. We kept our distance as much as possible with friends. We looked closer at the photographs of the happy gathering of many friends on the farm, eating pizza. It was the celebration of 40 years marriage. I had a huge cake made with a resemblance of the Utrecht Dom Cathedral, where we got married in the Netherlands. My wife's parents got married in the same church. Tradition. We talked for more than 2 hours. We remembered cutting firewood together and getting nearly stuck in muddy tracks. Good times. When they left, it was quiet in the house. 2 weeks from now we will know. As we said to each other, don't be scared for the virus, but do respect it.
Gus Vander Hoeven of Kansas State University with his weekly commentary on life in rural Kansas. That'll do it for a Wednesday edition. We'll be right back here this same time tomorrow, and we hope you'll rejoin us then. In the meantime, Eric Atkinson bidding you a good day for Agriculture Today. This is the K-State Radio Network.